Study Section 9. European competition for the Asian trade. Introduction. Having learnt that Portugal, Spain, France, England, and Holland competed for the Asian trade during the age of exploration in the previous study section, it is worthy to note that by the middle of the 16th century, a situation had arisen in which Western Europe was divided into two groups. Thus, this study section shall focus essentially on these groups: the pioneers of discovery and empire and the new group. Also, this section shall discuss extensively on the national rivalries and the struggle for political and economic power, which led to a challenge by the have-nots to the monopoly of discovery and wealth of the haves. Learning outcomes. When you are studying this section, you should be able to explain how Portugal competed with other European countries for the Asian trade and why they lost some of their old territories to these countries. 2. Highlight those factors that work for other European nations in their quest for wresting power from the two superpower countries for Asian trade. Terminology. Charter. A written grant by the sovereign or legislative power of a country, by which a body such as borough, company, or university is created or its rights and privileges defined. Medieval. Relating or likened to the Middle Age, especially in being cruel, uncivilized, or primitive. European presence in Asia. Portuguese experience. Western European rulers were determined to find new trade routes that were independent of the already existing ones. The Portuguese spearheaded the drive to find oceanic routes that would provide cheaper and easier access to South and East Asian goods. This chartering of oceanic routes between East and West began with the unprecedented voyages of Portuguese and Spanish sea captains. These voyages were influenced by medieval European adventurers who had journeyed overland to the Far East and contributed to geographical knowledge of parts of Asia upon their return. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa under the sponsorship of Portugal's John II, from which point he noticed that the coast swung northeast. Although his crew forced him to turn back, he was pleased with the prospect of soon finding a sea route to India and named the tip as the Cape of Good Hope. Later, starting in 1497, Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama made the first open voyage from Europe to India. In 1520, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator in the service of Spain, found a sea route to the Pacific Ocean. Bartolomé Dias, 1451 to 1500. Early in the 16th century of Afonso de Albuquerque left, emerged as the Portuguese colonial viceroy that was most instrumental in consolidating Portugal's holdings in Africa and Asia. He understood that Portugal could wrest commercial supremacy from the Arabs only by force, and therefore devised a plan to establish forts at strategic sites which could dominate the trade routes and also protect Portuguese interests on lands. In 1510, he seized Goa in India, which enabled him to gradually consolidate control of most of the commercial traffic between Europe and Asia. Largely through trade, Europeans started to carry on trade from forts, acting as foreign merchants rather than as settlers. In contrast, Early European expansion in the West Indies, later known to Europeans as a separate continent from Asia that they would call the Americas, following the 1492 voyage of Christopher Columbus, involved heavy settlements in colonies that were treated as political extensions of the mother countries. Lured by the potential of high profit from another expedition, the Portuguese established a permanent base south of the Indian trade, port of Calicut, in the early 15th century. In 1510, the Portuguese seized Goa on the coast of India. The Portuguese soon acquired a monopoly over trade in the Indian Ocean. His objective was Malacca, which controlled the narrow strait through which most Far Eastern trade moved. Captured in 1511, Malacca became the springboard for further eastward penetration. Several years later, the first trading posts were established in the Moluccas, or Spice Islands, which was the source for some of the world's most hotly demanded spices. By 1516, the first Portuguese ships had reached Canton on the southern coast of China. By 1557, the Portuguese gained a permanent base in China at Marcos, which they held until 1999. The Portuguese base at Goa and Malacca had now established a lucrative maritime empire in the Indian Ocean meant to monopolize the spice trade. The Portuguese also began a channel of trade with the Japanese, becoming the first recorded Westerners to have visited Japan. This contact introduced Christianity and firearms into Japan. Also, Portuguese explorers were establishing a very different sort of commercial empire in the Indian Ocean. This system was based on trade and war, rather than on taking large amounts of land and dominating its people. At first, the Portuguese had no competitions. The Chinese had called their fleet home. Indians and Arab ships did not carry guns, and other European nations had not yet entered the field. By the early 16th century, the Portuguese had established a string of strategic bases, including Hormuz at the tip of the Persian Gulf, Goa on the western coast of India, and the Strait of Malacca, the gateway between the Indian Ocean and the China Sea. From the bases, the Portuguese could control and monitor the sea-going trade of the entire region. Portuguese power, however, was entirely naval, and they were unable to threaten the internal strength of land-based empires. Moreover, when larger European nations arrived in the area, Portuguese naval supremacy vanished. Spanish, Dutch, and French expeditions. The energies of Spain, the other major colonial power of the 16th century, were largely concentrated on the Americas, North, South, and East Asia. But the Spanish did establish a footing in the Far East in the Philippines. After 1565, cargoes of Chinese goods were transported from the Philippines to Mexico and from there to Spain. By this long route, Spain reaped some of the profit of Far Eastern commerce. Spanish officials converted the island to Christianity and established some settlements. Permanently established the Philippines as the area of East Asia most oriented towards the West in terms of culture and commerce. The lucrative trade was vastly expanded when the Portuguese began to export slaves from Africa in 1541. However, over time, the rise of the slave trade left Portugal overextended and vulnerable to competition from other Western European powers. Envious of Portugal's control of trade routes, other Western European nations, mainly the Netherlands, France, and England, began to send in rival expeditions to Asia. In 1642, the Dutch drove the Portuguese out of the Gold Coast in Africa, the source of the bulk of Portuguese slave laborers, leaving this rich slaving area to other Europeans, especially the Dutch and the English. Rival European powers began to make inroads in Asia as the Portuguese and Spanish trade in the Indian Ocean declined, primarily because they had become hugely overstretched financially due to the limitations on their investment capacity and contemporary naval technology. Both of these factors worked in tandem, making control over Indian Ocean trade extremely expensive. Portuguese decline in Asia was accelerated by the attack on this commercial empire by the Dutch and the English, which began a global struggle over empire in Asia that lasted until the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. The Netherlands revolt against Spanish rule facilitated Dutch encroachment of the Portuguese monopoly over South and East Asian trade. The Dutch looked on Spain's trade and colonies as potential spoils in war. When the two crowns of the Iberian Peninsula were joined in 1581, the Dutch felt free to attack Portuguese territories in Asia. By the 1590s, a number of Dutch companies were formed to finance trading expeditions in Asia. Because competitions lowered their profits and because of the doctrines of mercantilism, in 1602, the companies united into a cartel and formed the Dutch East India Company and received from the government the right to trade and colonize territory in the area stretching from the Cape of Good Hope eastward to the Strait Magellan. In 1605, armed Dutch merchants captured the Portuguese fort at Amboina in the Moluccas, which was developed into the first secure base of the company. Over time, the Dutch gradually consolidated control over the great trading ports of the East Indies. Control over the East Indies trading ports allowed the company to monopolize the world spice trade for decades. Their monopoly over the spice trade became complete after they drove the Portuguese from Malacca in 1641 and Ceylon in 1658. Dutch East India Company colonies or outposts were later established in Assel 1667, Makassar 1669, and Batam 1682. The company established its headquarters at Batavia, today Jakarta, on the island of Java. Outside the East Indies, the Dutch East India Company colonies or outposts were also established in Persia, now Iran, Bengal, now Bangladesh, and parts of India, Siam, now Thailand, Guangzhou, Kato, China, Taiwan, 1624 to 1662, and Southern India, 1616 to 1795. In 1662, Zheng, Chenggong, also known as Kozing, expelled the Dutch from Taiwan. Further, the Dutch East India Company trade post on Dejima, 1641 to 1857, an artificial island off the coast of Nagasaki, was for a long time the only place where Europeans could trade with Japan. Study section summary. In this study section, you learned that 1. The Portugal and Spain not only pioneered but dominated European overseas ventures initially. 2. During this era of dominance, they monopolized the dividends of their expansion. 3. The desire of other nations to participate and benefit from the expansion resulted in intense rivalry amongst the various European nations. 4. The late arrivals to the expansion scene had to forcefully engage themselves by attacking the outposts of the already established nations. End of study section 5. Thanks for listening.